Okay. So right at the beginning of the semester, we kind of laid out the course for the class with talking about, back in the day, there was not wilderness. It was pretty extractive land use here in the U.S. And then kind of mid-century, mid-20th century, we get into this sense of, okay, we've kind of extracted all of the things, and we've clear-cut over and over, and we're starting to see some serious growing pains with prior to sustainable yield forestry. So enter wilderness, where it's like maximal preservation. And then we kind of, in that history narrative, we kind of slid to not really a halt, but really kind of camped for most all of the semester on kind of 1964 with the Wilderness Act up till, the last several decades where things have kind of been more or less ironed out. We get the eastern wildernesses, like here on the Shawnee with Roadless Area Review and Evaluation 2 in the 70s. But there was one more step that we never really landed super hard on, and it was a super significant one. So we just briefly mentioned it in kind of that history section, and then went on with, what's the practical stuff, how do we do some of these field techniques, all of that. So today we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about Alaska.
The movie or the state?
Probably the state.
I know, come on, man. It's a good-ass movie, though.
So in 1980, there was this thing called the Alaska National Interest Land Conservation Act. This was a pretty big deal. So in 1980, we're hot coming off of the 70s of the environmental movement, right? So peace, love, hippies, stuff like that.
Don't forget polyester pants.
There you go. There's a lot of this stuff going on, building up this head of steam. And then around 1980, it's at kind of a fever pitch. And then we start getting some, the pendulum starts swinging back the other way. So we get James Watt, Secretary of Interior under Reagan, who was not a super conservationist kind of a guy. He was like drill baby drill before that was a catchphrase.
So he pretty much tore up Texas and Oklahoma.
Opened up a lot of land to extraction, started laying the groundwork for more recent administrations to do stuff like delisting federally protected areas so they could be mined out and stuff like that.
That's why the Alaskan thing came in, because of all the oil up there.
Yeah, so in the 1980s, right, Alaska is really starting to go hard on oil field development and stuff like that. And at the same time, you got all this newfangled wilderness stuff of man, let's drop a polygon on this map and no more roads, no more structures. If any of that stuff is there, we're either going to let it just decay as an archaeological thing or just jackhammer it out, get rid of it. So the Alaska National Interest Land Conservation Act overnight took a huge proportion, I can't remember how many, hundreds of millions of acres, but took the entire United States National Park Service land, for example, in the continental United States, and doubled the landmass that the Park Service manages. Right, so Denali National Park, Gates of the Arctic, there's a couple other big ones. It also helped set up stuff Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, ANWR, which is where there's a whole bunch of drilling and stuff like that going on. And the key difference here, the big deal beyond just taking all of the land under federal management and 2xing that up to covering a huge chunk of Alaska. The other big deal with this was it recognized indigenous people. So Inuit, Yup'ik, there's dozens or hundreds of different native people groups, living all across northern Alaska, Canada, all of that stuff.
Siberian Bridge.
Yeah, really.
I didn't mean it as a joke, but I was being serious.
Well, yeah, and even today in places like Scandinavia, there are indigenous peoples, basically exactly the same or very similar to or analogous to our Inuit. We don't use the word Eskimo anymore. That was actually a white term that means cannibal that was used. It's kind of like the indigenous person N-word up there for a while. So we're kind of shifting away from that one. Downshifting a little bit on the racism. But anyway, so this was one of the first major land legislation things that tried to get some things right for the first time in a different way. So for example, a whole bunch of Alaskan National Wildlife Refuge, there's this place called Wrangell St. Elias up there, which is just this enormous polygon, probably not too far off the size of the state of Illinois. It's just like, it's one thing with a wildlife refuge system. And, you know, a bunch of this land is where Native Alaskans have been hunting caribou in particular, like, you know, for millennia or what have you. And the concern was we don't want to make the same mistake that a bunch of park forestry people, ecotourism development folks made down in Central America of, you know, there's a bunch of rich tourists who have a bunch of money that goes real far in a place like Costa Rica. So let's make a whole bunch of national parks in Costa Rica, and let's kick all the, you know, indigenous folks out, because now it's a national park. We got to have like our zip lines and our cloud forest huts and stuff. We can't have any like brown people running around. That'd be distracting, you know.
Can't have shooting arrows at us.
So this was a real problem all across the Caribbean, all across Central America, stuff like that. Like the UN Development Program, UN Environmental Program, they tried to help set up these parks and created the side effects of making it illegal for these indigenous people to live where they lived for, you know, thousands of years.
So basically, the Alaskan Act was just righting all the wrongs for the last 49 states.
Or at least trying to get it less wrong up in Alaska, where life is pretty hard, you know. So, like, caribou is like 98% of the diet of some of these groups where, you know, they're up above the Arctic Circle, the permafrost line. There's no, like, farming season in Nome, Alaska. It's just ice and snow year-round, and caribou migrating and stuff like that, and polar bears and all that. So, Anilka set up all of this land, and, crucially, it set up the right for all of those folks to continue to use places like Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, which is, you know, also used for drilling, and wildlife preservation, stuff like that, habitat management. They're allowed to do whatever they've been doing since forever, regardless of whether it's on that land. So, like how you and I can't go to the Shawnee and just kind of use it how our grandpappy used it, even if that used to be his farmland, you know, kind of thing.
But they get it because their grandfather didn't, because they've been using it for
Right.
we've been around.
And it gets tricky because I think the language in Anoka was, you know, traditional uses was like the key phrase, just like how untrammeled is one of the key phrases in the Wilderness Act, like, you know, not developed, it's not civilized, stuff like that. Traditional uses, you know, Congress put that in there basically to try and draw a pretty big circle around what the indigenous folks were able to do, what they were allowed to do. The goal being minimal disruption of their life and culture, and maximal addition of, like, let's get fish and wildlife in there, managing Wrangell St. Elias, managing Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, and enhancing that habitat, and everybody wins. Fish and wildlife takes on, you know, crazy huge millions of acres, additional stuff, and the natives folks get the benefit of, like, better proactive caribou herd management and stuff like that. Yeah.
So, when was this written? 1980?
1980 it was passed, yeah.
So, when they say traditional, does that mean like it's a hard point from traditional from 1980, Or is like from that point, like is there a threshold of what becomes tradition again?
There you go. Now you're thinking along the lines of, remember how we were talking about with the Wilderness Act, bicycles, not a traditional use, even though they'd been around for 80 years, before the Wilderness Act. Horses have been around for 10,000 years before the Wilderness Act, so they were allowed in and stuff like that. But there's no mention of stuff like GPSs aren't traditional, so you can't use those in wilderness, like GPS didn't exist back then.
Is it a compass or map?
Yeah, exactly. So, but it's not mechanical, even if it's super duper fancy electronics and stuff like that, so it's not really dealt with.
That's why Alaska hasn't put fire on the ground, because one, they don't need it, two, of all the protection that it has and all the conservation that's going into there, I'm assuming, right?
That's a whole other conversation. Wildfires up in Alaska had thousands of wildland firefighters up there fighting wildfires because the temperature anomaly is much, much bigger up there, up to 70 degrees higher.
Well, they weren't taking.
We're getting like
fuels,
510
right?
here. So, anyway, so Nash is on to something here. He's asking, so what's kind of the cutoff for traditional? And, by 1980, a lot of these native Alaskans had adopted things like internal combustion engines, mostly snow machines up there, like snowcats, snowmobiles. And they'd, adjusted from using spears to things like high-power rifles, where you can really reach out and touch somebody. Send some freedom seeds through that caribou and feed your family more successfully, more efficiently, yeah, and be a little bit more guaranteed on just having that nutrient source right through the winter. So that's an ongoing thing. With the ability to use snow machines and modern firearms with those big migratory herds across big areas, they were able to do pretty well. So the law worked in the sense of, all right, we want to try and not starve these people off the land so we can have, Wrangell St. Elias has 10, 11,000 visitors a year, right? I mean, SIU gets less visitation in a day than that place gets in a year. And it's, millions and millions of acres. So those 10, 11,000 folks, 15,000 maybe now, they're pretty spread out.
How do they rate this? Do they go to the tribe elders and ask them for help too?
Yeah, so if you've taken...
Because I'm just picking up
Yeah.
Nash's traditional question and what we were going off of with this versus traditional versus non-traditional. And if you really want to be a brass tacks asshole, you can't use the new snow boots. You gotta go to the moccasin fur wrapped with bears and fucking all that shit. But
Yeah, if you want to be a hardliner about it, yeah.
right, but that's why I asked the question: who actually helped write it? Because that would have had more influence on the language too.
Yeah, so if you've taken social influences with Kofi yet?
Of course, I just
Okay, yeah.
slept through it.
So if you think back to that class in natural resources planning with him, he talks about stuff like there's rational comprehensive planning, which is like the 1950s, 1960s, bunch of white guys, sitting in their three-piece suits, smoking cigarettes in the boardroom, kind of deciding for the rest of the country how things are going to go.
Darts on where they want shit. Yeah.
Right. Super duper top down. This is like federal government. We're here to tell you how high to jump and when. And then at the far other end of the spectrum, you have community-based natural resources management, where the local people have pretty much all of the agency, and they get to decide how their land is used and managed in a larger mosaic context, and stuff like that. And then we have adaptive management kind of in the middle, where it's the federal government, but they're at least every 5, 10, 20 years talking with the public, saying, hey, this is how things are going, we'd like your input, stuff like that. ANILCA was put together with some inputs. It wasn't perfect in the 1980s. We're still kind of figuring that stuff out. And in the 44 years since then, organizations like the Park Service are way smarter now about interfacing with indigenous native populations, and they still don't get it right all the time, of course, but they're pretty savvy about it now. They put a lot of attention and a ton of work by really smart people into making sure that everything is kind of ground truthed against, and not just like, here's our idea, what do you think of it? It's more a question of, hey, we need your ideas. So you tell us how to aim this thing, and we'll handle like the legal and regulatory side of it, but let's put something together, as a collaborative thing.
Discuss over years,
Yeah.
years and years what's actually
Right.
done.
Yeah. So it gets complex. The oil field installations, different presidents will like favor that or like try to de-emphasize it or whatever. And so there's like this expansion and contraction of the oil fields up in Arctic National Wildlife Refuge and stuff like that and around. And some of that stuff, because it's, over the road, ice road trucking to get everything back and forth and pipelines and stuff, that can kind of slice up some of that habitat and make things hard, even if ANILCA is trying to do wilderness the right way by the people who are affected by it, stuff like that. It's complicated. It's complicated. In every possible way that you can think of it being like harder than it should be, it is. So like up there, entire villages, as the permafrost line marches north with climate change and things warming up a lot up there, you'll have these like villages that were built on the edge of a river or something like that. Well, the ground thaws out and it's just like muddy, saturated ground, and all of a sudden, like, the stream channel starts to meander a whole lot more, and like the entire village starts sloughing off into the stream of the river. So they got that to deal with up there as well.
Do they work with Canadians?
It's a lot. Say again?
Do they work with the Canadians or the Russians, since there's so much close up there in the Arctic Circle? Or is it just strictly Alaska working with Alaska? They're not seeking problem. Let's say like
There is some transboundary stuff, mostly with herd migration. Yeah.
Well, I was also picking off of when that oil leak happened. I know like that was a huge thing in the '80s. Remember when that pipe or that oil tanker spilled up there?
Exxon Valdez? Yeah,
Yeah.
that was on the southern coast.
Oh, it was on the southern
Yeah,
coast.
that was a little bit further down off of Anchorage, I believe.
Okay, but it's still like Alaska that I was getting at was affected by that. Does that still play into that act that you're talking about? Since it's all of Alaska, does the waters count too?
Waters are a weird and strange and different thing. So,
Well, I'm asking as a conservation standpoint from the animals.
yeah.
You know, that's what I'm asking, because if you're protecting the land and the native and the unit way of them living, what are you doing for the caribou? What are you doing for the snow rabbit that lives up there? What are you doing for the waters that are over there too? Like, is that all part of that act too? That's the main thing I was getting at.
So these days, with the ocean level being where it is, Russia is essentially isolated from the Aleutian Islands, which are peopled by the Aleuts, Native Americans who are known to ride open ocean waves in their kayaks at up to 50 miles an hour as they hunt whales. Like, I would say that's metal AF, except there's no
gnarly.
metal, it's all wood and hide kayak. I mean, that's amazing. Anyway,
So it's wood.
so they're pretty ecologically isolated. But Canada, Yukon Territory, Northwest Territory, all that stuff, that's right here, and there's a bunch of wildlife migration back and forth. So there is some coordination on that, for sure. There's not a ton that I'm aware of, because there doesn't have to be a ton of coordination. There's just so much boundary here. It's just like, let
Well,
the herds roam.
Right, but I was thinking like, what if, say, I know this is an impossible question because it can't happen. Let's say a hunter's chasing a caribou, jumps from Alaska to Canada. I know it can't have physically happen, but is that still part of the act? Like, is that caribou still protected under the Alaskan Treaty Act of 1980? Or is he now a Canadian citizen who is now fleeing from the Mounties?
You know what? I'm not real sure about that one.
Well, it's
I doubt they're.
I would imagine if they're blood trailing something like 50 yards across the line, just get it. Like,
But you get-
Like, there's not a bunch of border control stations in northern Alaska, you know?
I was only asking that question because of what we brought up with the Wilderness Act in
Yeah.
'64, how they use the verbiage
Mhm.
as literally like a lawyer would. So I'm wondering if it's the same lingo in that act. That's why I was asking.
They do. They have to. It's a law. But it was written so much later. So, this is after the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, NEPA.
The air pollution in the 1970s, oil crisis and all that stuff.
Yeah, it was pretty nuts. So ANILCA it's a little bit more, it's kind of a next generation law from us. Again, it's not perfect, right? Like
Right.
it set up some problems with those oil fields and people trying to live off of caribou and stuff like that. But it put a lot more tools in the tool chest of the wilderness rangers and stuff like that to be able to work with folks instead of against them,
So basically, they're not up there trying to write tickets like they are in Wyoming versus they're up there trying to make sure everyone's getting food and not dying throughout the winter. Basically, is what you're.
Yeah, by and large.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a very different kind of life up there.
Right. Versus the Wyoming life, where they're hunting and just to be assholes poaching.
Yeah, and Wyoming is also pretty much big game hunting and oil, but it's a pretty different vibe. Yeah, pretty different vibe for sure. They're both mostly really small towns, though. So that's kind of what's going on with the Alaskan side of things, and it is different. Some of the Alaskan wilderness is like gates of the Arctic, which are like down here on, this isn't really a peninsula, like this is all just Canada. There's a whole bunch of little islands and stuff here. So gates of the Arctic it's beautiful. It's a whole bunch of kayakable land, like beautiful green boreal forest, stuff like that. Kodiak Island's right over here, so the grizzly bear action is pretty intense up through this way, and so forth. But the management there it's a little bit more focused on wildlife impacts and a little bit less worried about stuff like overcrowding. So we can use the same tools, just in different emphasis
Right. we're
to
putting
reflect
this
that.
tool first for that tool that they'll use in different
Yeah.
parts of the country. or
Exactly.
different scenarios.
Exactly. So if you're going, kayak camping for 2 weeks through Gates of the Arctic, there's an excellent chance you're never going to see anybody the entire time that you're out there. Excellent chance, even if you're looking.
Versus where we're going out in the East Coast, we're gonna run into people.
Oh, 100%. Yeah.
Right.
And there's a little bit more regulation for some of these different wilderness areas. Like if you're kayak self-supported, part of your cargo load has to be, a deep cycle, essentially an RV battery, a 60-pound deep cell gel or absorbed glass mat battery to run a grizzly electric fence while you're out there and stuff like that. Like, most folks are carrying large caliber guns, usually slug guns, for the inevitable grizzly encounters and stuff like that.
They're just hungry for some honey.
And that's not something we really worry about on the Shawnee, right? Even with black bears. We do have black bears occasionally here in Illinois, but
They just run off because they're so scared.
yeah.
Oh, brown bear.
And grizzlies aren't largely that different. They're mostly just like a black bear, just trying to get enough food before the winter, but they see us a little bit differently
Yeah, we're
as,
hot dogs.
part of that menu instead of
Yeah.
an impediment to it. So ANILCA set up these huge Alaskan areas, and the most important thing for us with wilderness management is if you are thinking about being a wilderness ranger up in Alaska, like a backcountry patrol ranger out in it, this is the area where you can get postings where you helicopter in. So you get dropped off by helicopter with like 4 months of supplies and provisions and stuff at the helipad. And then maybe not, depending on how far north you are, you get resupplied once. and then you get picked up by helicopter on your way out at the end of the time.
And
And
they're dropping the next guy in as they're coming out.
no, there's nobody there over the winter, typically,
Oh, gotcha.
because it's -40, -60, stuff like that. Like you need specialized. You basically need moon suits to live in that kind of terrain.
One of my coworkers from the summer, he was from Alaska. He worked through a contracting company to set up like research tents in the Arctic Circle.
Mm-hmm.
And then also like just tents for like hunting guides and stuff. He was just there to like do the and camp management.
Uh-huh.
I guess one night it got to -70 and they're in these these double wall tents that have like lofts, and the guy who's sitting next to the wood stove said that he was plenty warm and quit feeding the wood stove,
Oh shit.
and some of the people sleeping in the lofts of the tent woke up with frostbite.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Prick.
even at like -30, -40, you're starting to get into, I need to start using respiration equipment to not frostbite my lungs literally with each breath. Right? So 30 degrees colder than that is like instant ice crystals popping the tissue of your lungs, your alveolar sacs, and you can drown in your own lungs that way.
I'm going to Alaska, boys.
So,
I'll go back to Australia.
it's okay. People who are up there year round know this stuff is coming. It's not particularly a surprise, and you prepare and you adapt for it. When I did a wilderness research project with Denali National Park up in Alaska, we were there for about 10 days. We were working with a chief of resource, a guy named Joe Van Horn at the time, and he lived and worked out of Talkeetna, the little gateway community right in front of the mouth of the road into Denali. And, he told us how, and he's got his big old extended bed pickup truck. Twice a year, he and his wife would drive 6 hours one way to get groceries, and then drive it on back up and live for 6 months at a time, right? The frost line up there was like 8 or 10 feet down. You had to bury stuff more than 8 feet down in trenches for your piping not to freeze and stuff like that. Like it is what it is. You just, you head up there for a detail and you get used to it. Up there you'll see everybody's diesel trucks. They'll have an extension cord plug, female end, sticking out the end of their engine grill. It's an engine block heater and an oil pan heater to make sure that the diesel doesn't gel at
Stays warm.
negative however many ridiculous degrees it gets, so you can not brick your engine. It's pretty nuts.
That same guy was on one of those expeditions. He's really cool. He's also a huge person. This guy is like a massive dude. But the corners of his mustache were peeking out, and they got condensation on him
Yep.
from breathing.
So like icicles and stuff.
And he got frostbite on the corners of his lips. This is, if you go to his Facebook, he rocks like an Amish beard for a while, like super Amish. And it was because where he got frostbite, his hair stopped growing
Oh yeah.
for a while until all of it totally healed. But it was super funny. I asked him about that, and then he told me why he had an Amish beard for a while. And I was like, that's insane. He goes, yeah, it's just like a casual year in Alaska. I was like, what the fuck?
Yeah. So your PPE has to have a good seal, because moisture, will get to the edge, and then ice expands as it freezes, right? So frost wedging, it's enough to pop rocks off of cliff faces and stuff, make new climbing routes, whatever, or destroy old ones. Same thing can happen on your face, and you're legit wearing a respirator mask, respirator style mask. It looks like a mini truck radiator over your nose and mouth, and what it does is it heats the fins of the radiator every time you breathe out, so that when you breathe in, it warms up and moistens up that air, because cold air is very, very dry. Cold air, the colder it is, the less moisture it can hold. So you can get really dehydrated doing winter Alaskan stuff without even realizing it, just because you're breathing like 0% humidity air continuously. Anyway, so yeah, the air that we are breathing out is 100% saturated. This is one of the primary functions of your lungs and sinuses, to get enough moisture into the air so that oxygen exchange can happen across a whole bunch of wet cell membranes, right? With every breath. So it's pretty good at hydrating that air in a hurry. And yeah, you basically have like a prosthetic lung respirator device. Oh, it's nuts. It's nuts up there. Anyway, so that's Alaskan Wilderness. It's a little bit different. And if you get the hankering to work a summer up there, you know, Forest Service, Park Service, whatever, absolutely go and do it.
That's what,
It's awesome.
Samantha
It's awesome.
from summer camp has got a pretty neat job.
Up there?
Yeah,
McKenna's in
she's
there too.
Samantha is flying into roadless rural communities
Okay.
and then hosting like a 2-week long like summer camp thing for those communities.
Nice.
Like those groups of communities.
Very cool. Yeah. I hope she's ready. It's a sausage fest up there. It's like 10 to 1 men to
Yeah, I
women.
know.
Yeah, no, that's what
In some
that's-
places like 15 or 20.
That's what I told her, because
Yeah.
my coworker again was sharing me all sorts of stories up there, and when we were driving around doing arborist work, you know, we'd see people, and he'd be like, you know, believe it or not, an Alaska 10 right there. And I was like, you're insane.
Alaska 10.
I heard the same thing.
Yeah, so yeah, maybe we'll just drop a note to Sam. Just be like, hey.
No, I did. I warned her. I was like, hey, like,
Just be
Yeah.
warned.
like, be mindful. And I guess like,
So let's end with this. If you decide to go up to Alaska to work wilderness or other forestry stuff, but you're looking for a lady, the odds are not good, and the goods might be odd. Okay. So, with that, we'll send class today. And
I like how you ended it like on that note, like, hey, if you're looking for a lady, don't bother.
yeah, not in Alaska.
so let's do our one-word final.
Tomorrow.
Like the real world, open notes if you have them. Like, I don't want to penalize people for writing good notes and not being able to access them. All right?
How exciting.
Are we getting ready for this? Yep.
Good deal.
Oh, we need to walk us in 3 minutes for class. There it is.
So is the
Ready?
list of words just gonna be on D2O?
Say again?
Is the list of words to pick from just gonna be on D2O?
If I get to it.
Yeah,
It's not going to be anything
Or we'll
exotic.
show up and
Yeah.
do it?
It'll
Okay.
just be,
That's fine.
it'll be super duper the stuff we talked about the whole time. I'm not trying to trick you guys.